So joining me now is longtime Assistant District Attorney Melanie Shekita. Melanie, you have been a prosecutor here in Wake County for more than 25 years. Wow. And now you're running for District Attorney here in Wake County. You've had a really illustrious career.
That's a lovely word to say. It's been a long one, but I've really enjoyed it. Obviously, I wouldn't be here for 27 years if I didn't enjoy what I did.
I always think when I see you in trial that you're just really a bulldog in the courtroom when it comes to getting justice, but I've also seen really a sentimental side of you, really getting very close to these families, to these victims. One case that was like this was just a couple months ago. We're talking about the case of Christopher McCullough, who brutally attacked his parents up in the Harrington Grove subdivision. Tell me when you first learned about this case and the subsequent just brutal attack.
So it was assigned to me fairly or within a couple of weeks. It was awful. We don't have people typically charged with murder that murder people with their bare hands. And his mother, Christopher McCullough's mother, Mary, was ill. She had an oxygen tank, so she was very frail. Didn't have a chance against his size and strength. And there had been a long-standing issues with domestic violence in that home. And at the time of her death, her husband, John, had sought the assistance of a restraining order because they had exhausted all of really the leads they felt like they could do. They had had him hospitalized. They had had him committed. They had done everything you can possibly imagine that two parents could try to do to get their son some help. And then ultimately, he tried to kill both of them.
And at the time of the attack, when he came to the house, I remember it was in August, they were watching his child. I mean, they basically had primary custody, right?
The mother had custody, but she and had gotten custody from him for all of his longstanding issues. But she allowed his parents, the paternal grandparents, to have lots of visitation with their son. And they were very supportive and helpful to her as well. I believe, I'm not entirely sure. It depends on who you talk to, whether
Ask,
he
right.
knew, right, whether the defendant knew that his son was at the grandparents' home. But I believe he did and went there to see him.
But he knew he wasn't supposed to be there. As you mentioned,
Right.
John had the restraining order against him. So tell me, we learned this in trial. We saw a lot from the Ring camera doorbell video, kind of how this just brutal attack took place.
So he came in and spoke to his mother by looking at, you can hear that from the Ring camera, and you can hear both, I believe both mother and father, their grandparents, telling his young son to get to the back because they were worried about it. There's, because Ring camera is motion activated, there's a period of time that you don't hear anything. I think, and what I argue to the jury is you can hear him hit his mother as soon as he walks in there because she makes some sort of audible gasp. Certainly that's my inference. I don't know that for certain. And then about 30 minutes later, less than 30 minutes later, you see the defendant leaving with his son and the family dog and saying some really obscene things to his mother, who is laying there dying in her own blood. And then there's surveillance when he takes his son to the hotel where he was staying, and then ultimately brings the son back to the mother. And
Right. And we
and when police get there, she's lying in her own blood, and his father is so disoriented because of hit some blows to his head. He didn't know what time of day it was. He didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, we see a lot of surveillance video of him walking through that hotel. It looked like he took out the trash. I believe, from my recollection, he changed his clothes, and the young son, his child, is in tow. Just
Yeah.
kind of heartbreaking to see all of this. So John survives. Mary, who, as you mentioned, had an illness and was, if I remember right, less than 100 pounds or so.
Yes.
I remember the autopsy photos that we saw in trial, Melanie, were just horrific.
Horrific. And the way that Emmy would describe is that there were five planes of her head that had to have been struck. So it wasn't just a punch to the face and then she fell. There were five separate injuries to her head that could not be attributed to one strike.
Right. So one of the things that we don't often see, but we did in this case, is Christopher McCullough. He takes the stand in his own defense. I had seen him in court for many, for his first appearance and subsequent bond hearings and things of that nature, and he just struck me as someone that showed no remorse. He was very odd, making really off-putting comments to the judge. So he takes the stand. What was your strategy in cross-examining him? Because I know as a reporter and as many onlookers, that were in court that day in the gallery, we were just sort of dumbfounded by his demeanor and his responses.
Well, I mean, to be fair, he was adopted and he had mental illnesses, but he would never take his medication, and so that's often a problem, right? When you have someone that needs to take medicine, and he certainly didn't. His testimony was bizarre. Was he trying to play crazy? I don't know, but to show, he got up and said, "I didn't mean to kill my dad because if I wanted to, I would have." I do think that the jury took that to show that he was mentally ill. I think they thought maybe and again, I can't get into their heads, but that it took some time for them to deliberate on the felony murder of the mother. And so and they ultimately did not find him guilty of attempted murder of his dad. So I don't know if part of it was they felt sorry for him, whether part of it was that they were, sometimes to get back there and compromise. I'm not sure, but it was bizarre. It was a bizarre trying
I
to
re-
cross-examine someone who may not have the same. It was difficult. It was very difficult.
Yeah, he was talking about spells and
Yes.
witches and demons and spirits. He had mentioned that he was up for 6 days on alcohol or on Adderall, we should say, and he
Mhm.
had been drinking, obviously just sleepless. And he talked about that at length, that was something that he did frequently was go on these long binges
Right.
and staying up. What was your strategy in terms of prosecuting this case? Obviously, we know in the end you got that first degree murder conviction. His defense attorney had originally said, he went to the house to get gas money, and his fight or flight mechanism sort of kicked in when John, his father, approached him. Kind of just a bizarre strategy from the defense, in my opinion. But what was your strategy going in to prove this brutal murder of his own mother?
So I think that had to be the focus, right? Because there's no explanation for what he did to her. And I think he said she lunged and fell. I think she hit her head against the wall. And so he denied doing that. And again, can't get into the jury's head, but what they told us is certainly the different areas on her head were would not be accounted for the story that he told, where he hit her, I think he said, and she fell against the wall. But to suggest, that either of these two elderly folks were going to attack, he was 6 something. He was a very large male, and it didn't make any sense. But I congratulate his attorney. He did a really good job with um, getting him not guilty of the attempted murder of the dad. And that was a strategy I took, and I told his lawyer that I wished I hadn't. I went for the higher charge of attempted murder on the dad instead of the assault. And they told me they would have been back in a couple of minutes if that's what I had done. So, he did a really good job for him.
Yeah, I want to get to you speaking to the jury in just a minute because I remember they did come out. You guys talked to them, but John McCullough spoke during the victim impact statements. I remember, he didn't look at Chris. Chris really showed no remorse. And one of the things I remember was him saying, your mother loved you. She tried so hard with you. And then he kind of ended with, prison is kind of right where you need to be, hopefully, to get the help that you need. It's always heartbreaking, Melanie, to listen to family speak, and you could tell that John just wanted this whole chapter in their lives to be kind of done and over with.
He always wanted him to get help. Even in the beginning, I had to convince him that this is not a case where someone's going to go to a mental hospital, right? That's not this case. He my position and my argument was he was well aware of his faculties, even though he had been up this day. He made these very conscious efforts to get rid of his clothes, several different things to show. But John and Mary, up until the day she died, probably even that day, was giving him money and was trying to help him. Even though he was on probation for violating that restraining order, they still were trying, even at the end, to try and get him some help. I think what brought John around, honestly, was that nothing other than four walls in jail was going to protect the public from their son. And it took over a year for him to come to that place because they really wanted to get him help. He testified at length, I believe. I know we talked in length about all the places that they had taken him and that they would keep him for a period of time and they would let him back out. And then he would start using drugs instead of taking his medicine. And so it was this constant cycle over and over again. And even towards the end, like you said, at the victim impact statement, he still wanted him to get some help. And Mary McCullough loved Christopher.
Yeah.
Was giving him money up until she knew he couldn't be there, but was giving him money every day, according to his girlfriend.
And one of the things I remember too regarding this is that he had a lot of prior convictions and a lot of prior arrests. I think it was more than 17 that we uncovered. So, as you mentioned, jail, prison now is certainly where he should be. Now, I remember afterwards, kind of reporters were kind of just sitting there, after the verdict, and I noticed something that was just a little bit different is that the majority of the jurors came out and kind of beeline to you. I always wanted to ask you, and I don't know how much you can share, but I know it's probably always very interesting to hear from jurors, to hear kind of their take on things or perhaps what you could have done differently. But I always wanted to know kind of, what do you gather or glean from them kind of coming up to you and kind of discussing, how they felt as they were deliberating?
It's always great if they'll stay back. I'll talk to someone, even if it's a not guilty, right? I want to know what I can do better, what they needed to hear. In a recent case, I tried the technology was a disaster in the Wake County Courthouse or the Wake County Justice Center could use a lot of revamping in that regard. And so they'll talk to me about tech issues. But in this case, as I mentioned, I realized I screwed up. I made it a lot harder for them by trying to proceed on the attempted murder versus the felony assault. And they said, had you done that, we would have been back really quickly. And so Ricky Elmore, the defense attorney, was there too, and we laughed about it. I said, you did a great job, and I could have made it a lot easier for myself. So that's very good for me. Moving forward, why would I try to work harder, not smarter? So I always learn something. We call it the practice of law. You never quite get it right, and learning from them is very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, certainly a heartbreaking case, but one where you ended up with a conviction. And of course, we wish you the best of luck as the campaign sort of rolls on. And tell me, just to close, Melanie, you are running for district attorney, 27 years in the Wake County Attorney's Office, and tell us about your qualifications.
As I mentioned, I've worked under two very long-standing DAs. I've been able to learn from their leadership styles and their management styles. I know that I have the heartbeat of the folks in the office and what they would like to see. When I started 27 years ago, Wake County was not 1.2 million people. We have to adapt and change. I think, unfortunately, we've seen a rise in gun violence and violence in general, and I think that's something that we need to make it a priority to identify those folks and try them in an efficient and quick manner. We've seen a rise in juvenile crimes, juvenile violent crimes, and I would like to partner with the community members to maybe target why this is happening, or work with groups to have alternatives for children. I don't think a 13-year-old wakes up and says, I'd like to murder someone, right? I don't think that's what your childhood suggests. So there needs to be a way to hold people accountable who are giving these firearms. And that's a priority that I'd like to address.